I suppose going back a few years, Myanmar with the army regime under a military junta with lots of different allegations against it of human rights violations and everything else would have been one of the last places you would have expected to see the kinds of changes we have over the past 2 years in terms of the release of political prisoners, the opening up of the country internationally in many ways, the removal of Western sanctions, and progress on a number of different fronts, politically, economically, and in terms of the armed conflict as well. I think it's curious because to some extent it's unexpected. I think there were some of us who said even 3-4 years ago that there would be some kind of change, that the army was looking for a way out, there would be a new constitution, some sort of elections, perhaps some economic reform. But I think the speed, the pace of the changes has been remarkable in many ways, and the fact that it's been peaceful and without really any serious resistance or pushback, at least so far. I think it's curious because it's a country which is so poor, which has been involved in so many intractable and violent conflicts, where we have seen so many horrible human rights abuses for decades, that you could see what has been so far a peaceful and smooth transition. I think is something that's curious, and I think it's only maybe 20-30 years from now, looking back, if it is a successful transition to a more democratic government in a peaceful country, we will understand fully what the reasons were behind it, either structurally in terms of the economy and everything else, or in terms of the individual people who've been involved. I think it's unfinished because really it's only the first steps that have been taken, really important steps, but many enormous things that still have to be done if the country is actually going to be a democratic and a peaceful country. I would say the most important thing is to find a way out of the civil war, the armed conflicts that have been part of the country's political scene since independence in 1948. It's easier said than done. On the one hand, I think there is an enormous amount of popular support on all sides to finding a way to a sustainable peace and to leaving aside all the different violent conflicts that have been present for such a long time. But again, that's easier said than done. And how does one do that? Not just between the government and one non-state armed group, but at least a dozen. And on the side, dozens of other militia. I think we've seen in other countries how difficult it is to conclude a civil war between just two foes. And in this case, we have so many. So I think we're just at the beginning of that process. I would say that's the most important by far. So far, we don't really have what one would call sort of a peace process involving everyone. What we have, and I think we have to be very clear about this, are simply ceasefire agreements between the government and 11 non-state armed groups. And all of these non-state armed groups represent or say they represent different ethnic minorities. But there's a difference between, I think, the process where we have to come up with a more inclusive national identity, where we have to end ethnic discrimination, where we have to find a way where people accept this country as their home from whatever different ethnic group they may be from. That's different than ending the armed conflict. The armed conflict involves both ethnic minority groups, but they also involve lots of other interests as well, including business interests. So it's a very complicated picture. And I think we've only taken the very first initial steps towards addressing either of those things, either coming up with a more sort of inclusive sense of Myanmar citizenship and identity, but also in finding a way out of the armed conflicts themselves as well. I don't think the Constitution itself bans women. I mean, the only thing is that the office of the president has to be someone who has military experience. And so that's an effective ban on most women, because the army is overwhelmingly, especially the officer corps, are overwhelmingly men. But women can be MPs, women can be cabinet ministers. So the problem is not the Constitution, the problem is the reality of the situation. The reality of the situation is that this is a country that's been under army government since 1962. The army is almost all men. almost all cabinet officers, all people in senior positions have been men for decades. And that has cultural, political reasons as well as realities that have to change. So I think we can point to specific laws or specific things that need to change as well, but I think unless we tackle the underlying dynamics that have resulted in the country being ruled almost entirely by men, I don't think things are going to change just because of a change in the law or a change in the constitution.